years, and he's led some courses in that too. And he's been all over New Mexico. So I think it'll be very, very interesting to us. And those are the last three we did was for the history of like Nob Hill and the history of our church and the history of New Mexico. So we felt that he would be a good person to talk to us about that. So Ted, I'm going to give you the floor, okay?
Okay, Ryan, do you have it set to record?
Are streaming live and you are spotlighted, ready to go.
Okay, Eleanor's playing with the controls, but anyway, here we go. When Lew Wallace, who wrote Ben-Hur, was a territorial sheriff, territorial governor of New Mexico, he commented in terms of governance that in New Mexico, whatever worked elsewhere was doomed for failure in New Mexico. And there are reasons behind that. So some of this reflects this different tradition with which we are endeavoring to live. This is actually broken down in two parts. The short first section is one I wrote originally to be used for clergy considering coming to New Mexico, because I have known a number that once they realized what they gotten into, couldn't wait to escape. And I have shared this with a active Presbyterian layperson in the AAUW that says the Presbyterians have had the same problem. And I'm certain many of the lawyers or the medical people or other professionals recruited to come to New Mexico that within 2 to 4 years suddenly have advancements for positions outside of the state. Or part of this, they're unwilling to tell the truth that they don't understand the state and don't want to try. So welcome to New Mexico. This is really part of the United States and has been since 1846, though the Santa Fe Trail from 1821 has provided Anglo influence since that time. An explanation, though the English-speaking world has historically identified cultures by the color of their skin, the local Spanish culture has identified by the language in the home. So if you speak English in the home, you are Anglo, as in Anglo-Saxon. There are 8 indigenous languages taught in various schools in New Mexico, 5 Pueblo languages, Athapascan for the Navajo and Apache, Spanish and English. We who are English speakers are the newcomers, which requires our respect for the older cultures. Speaking of newcomers, the oldest Paleo-Indian sites universally recognized in the Western Hemisphere were first identified here in New Mexico, dating from 8 to 12,000 years before present. Corn has been farmed in New Mexico for at least the last 1,600 years. 2 of the oldest towns in the United States, Acoma and Taos, both date from before 1350, with the same people living there ever since. Coronado spent 2 years on the west side of Albuquerque, 67 years before Jamestown was established. With this combination of cultures and languages, and no ethnic group reaching 50% of the population, we have had to learn respect for all the cultures present in this state. I personally find this mixture both educational and enjoyable. And aside, if you feel short of breath here, remember, for instance, I'm only about 30 feet below being a mile high. The top of the Sandia Mountains to the east is over 2 miles high, and problems in this community with altitude are common, so be prepared. We're also religiously diverse. All of the 19 Pueblos have preserved religious traditions for hundreds of years. The Navajo sand painting may have come from Asia. There's a strong Jewish element from forced conversion by Ferdinand and Isabel in 1492 in Spain, which influences the Catholic community. and of course, Protestant. We also had the most photogenic mosque in the Western Hemisphere above Abiquiu, the national center of the Sikh religion in Espanola, Tibetan Buddhist stupas in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and a strong hippie New Age tradition in parts of the state. The one major religious pilgrimage site, which gets international coverage in the United States, is the Good Friday trip to Chimayo, which sometimes has over 30,000 participants. Respect for all of these traditions is part of the fabric of New Mexico. Again, welcome to New Mexico. Then I have, from 30 years of teaching New Mexico history as part of the Citizenship and Community Badge to the Boy Scouts on base, where virtually none of these are native to New Mexico. And some of the parents, particularly the enlisted, think at first when they're assigned to Kirtland that they're being assigned to a foreign country. This is some background I have shared over 30 years with the Scouts. First, the Native Americans. A century and a quarter ago, most, quote, authorities considered Native Americans to be in the Western Hemisphere for only about 30,000 years before present. Finds in New Mexico ended that. In 1919, there was a flash flood on the dry Cimarron River, and the Folsom phone operator lost her life, but was a hero because she saved over 20 lives downstream by staying at the switchboard, giving out warning until flood washed her away. And a number of lives were lost in this. Some months later, a black cowboy, a ranch foreman named George McJenkins, rode past the wall of the riverbank, saw exposed bones in a wall of the stream bank, which had eroded during the flood. A son of slaves, he was self-educated, but of very significant intellectual ability and widely read. He believed this site should be excavated. And he tried for the rest of his life, but he died before the research began. There was no archaeological agency in the new state of New Mexico. Finally, in the 1920s, the Denver Museum excavated the site, and unfortunately now the finds are in the Denver Museum and not in New Mexico. I knew a cowboy who, as a young man living near Kiowa School, rode about 12 miles horseback to the site and in some manner took part in this excavation. McJenkins may have butchered buffalo in the Texas plains as a young man. Anyway, he knew the bones he saw in the riverbank were something special. It turned out it was a kill site of Taylor bison, a larger bison than the present buffalo, and now extinct. In this excavation, they found a spear point embedded in a rib of one of the animals, certainly a Paleo-Indian kill site. At that time, there was no carbon dating, but this is a very volcanic area with ash deposits from volcanoes, both above and below the site. Though through chemical analysis, this was determined which volcanoes were represented and dated from that to about 10,000 years before present. This totally upset the study of Paleo-Indian studies in North America. Now this has been redated to about 8,000 years before present, past the end of the Ice Age, but still ancient. Since then, the Blackwater Draw between Clovis and Portales has been developed as a mammoth kill site, about 10,000 years before present. A classmate in 1963 spent a summer as volunteer at this site and did a formal report in my undergraduate research site on this excavation. Both sites use spears instead of bow and arrow. It is now assumed that the compound bow, as such, was not widely used in the Americas until about 3,000 years ago. At least 3 Atlantis spear throwers have been found in dry caves in New Mexico, so it's not that far back. Both the Folsom and Clovis cultures are now found and recognized from central Mexico to Canada. Other sites, including Sandia Cave near Albuquerque, have been argued as older, but Folsom and Clovis still stand as the two oldest accepted Paleo-Indian cultures in North America. Pit houses and very small corn cobs have been found in the San Francisco River Valley in southwestern New Mexico, dating from before 400 AD, according to carbon dated. There were farmers in the area. They weren't savages, they were farmers. Correctly known now as ancestral Pueblo, though still incorrectly called Anastasi, which is an Athabascan word simply meaning ancient ones. By 1000 AD, farming was widespread throughout the state. And it's dated by dendrochronology, tree ring dating, accurate really to within a year or two as to when a particular tree limb or beam used in a building was cut. Sunset Crater Volcano in the Flagstaff, Arizona area erupted in 1064 AD, which caused abandonment of some villages, new ones established. Choco Canyon was a center from around 1150 to 1350, as with the site in Guatemala, one of the two greatest pre-Columbian astronomical sites in the Western Hemisphere. Pottery was around 800, 900. Basket work, woven feather blankets, pit houses to above ground dwellings all took place before that. There was trade to Mexico for live tropical birds, not just the feathers. They traded for the whole bird, and every time the bird molted and shed feathers, they used them. Came from Mexico. Other items like seashells came from the Pacific. Turquoise from New Mexico was traded to Mexico and other areas. Apparently, there was some interconflict among the indigenous peoples too, because this has been excavated at Rattlesnake Ridge, north of Cuba, to about 1240 AD. Pueblo Bonito at Choco Canyon had the largest number of rooms of any structure until a tenement house in 1880 in London eclipsed it. This area was abandoned in the early 1300s, possibly due to drought. Most of these people moved to major river valleys during and after this drought. An explanation of this is needed. Pueblo means town or village, small town in Spanish. As part of the rearrangement of the status in northern New Mexico following the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, the Native American farming communities were granted, quote, town, unquote, status, Pueblo status, by the King of Spain, most of them between 1700 and 1720. This included farmland, grazing land, and access to forested areas for firewood and construction materials. Thus, they had the same legal status as the Spanish towns being established in New Mexico. This legal status continued under the Mexican government and was recognized under the International Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. None of the other Native American reservations in this nation have this status. The BIA insists that this is not significant, but the BIA has been more flexible on some land grant claims of property taken from Pueblo land in the past than it has with some of the other Native American peoples. 5 languages coming from this civilization are still extant in New Mexico. Piro and Tompiro are now lost, though they were spoken until after the Revolt of 1680. Hopi and Arizona also predates the newcomers. As a living language, it is necessary to preserve a culture. The Pueblo people have done an excellent job in maintaining their identity. Then we have the newcomers. Sometime after about 1420, Athabascan-speaking peoples arrived from Western Canada. These include the Apache, which seem to have been in and around the Oklahoma Panhandle around 1540 from what we can make of the Spanish records, and the Navajo, though they claim to have arrived earlier. However, the Navajo dialect can still communicate with Alaskan natives, so this earlier date is suspect. The first dated raid that we've been able to establish of the Apache on the Pueblos was in 1527 in the Galisteo Basin. Ute and Kiowa were already to the north and east of the Rio Grande settlements. With the acquisition of the horse, the Ute to the north of Taos moved out on the plains and became the Comanche. The combination of Athabascan, Ute, and Comanche almost resulted in the destruction of both the Spanish and Pueblo settlements, which we'll discuss later. Of the currently occupied Pueblo town communities, Third Mesa, Hopi, Acoma, and Taos were all established by dendrochronology dating prior to or around 1330. In 1540, when Coronado explored the area and spent 2 winters on the west side of Albuquerque, there were 56 reported Pueblos. Coronado State Monument of Bernalillo is the best example of these historic but abandoned communities open to the public. All but 2 of the current existing Pueblos are matrilineal. The 5 living Pueblo languages are very much alive, with Curzian having been taught in Bernalillo schools fairly recently, and Towa still required of Jemez men in order to participate in community activities. That is a quick survey of the Native American. The Spanish. Cabeza de Vaca may have entered New Mexico during his trek from East Texas to the west coast of Mexico in the 1530s. He certainly was in view of some of the mountains along the southern edge of New Mexico, because that's right next to the pass across the Continental Divide. From his report and companions' information of the golden cities to the north, Coronado set forth an expedition in 1540 from the west coast of Mexico to explore to the north, entering from what is now Arizona near the Zuni Pueblos. He and his men rather thoroughly explored the area, including the Grand Canyon, all of northern New Mexico, wintering in Albuquerque 2 years, with a winter encampment found near Lubbock, Texas in recent years. The exact route of his tour into Kansas has yet to be established, and I suspect that he may have not gotten that far. The directions on the high plains without mountains, and even the pioneers coming west in the covered wagons, navigated by compass, gives some indication of the inability to establish these routes. The exact route, no gold was found by Coronado, though his route across the Ortiz Mountains, northeast of Albuquerque, went up a drainage where a major gold strike was made about 1823. His men walked over one of the more significant gold-producing areas of the state without finding their quest. His return to Mexico was considered a failure. The priests left in the Pueblos were quickly killed. In the next 58 years, several expeditions, legal and otherwise, entered into New Mexico. It is reported that an inscription of a priest dating from the 1580s has been found northeast of Albuquerque. However, as it is on Pueblo land, research is being discouraged. The mineralization of the Cerrillos Hills was documented in the late 1580s. Before 1590, one unauthorized settlement was removed by the Spanish authorities, having been here for several years, and the settlers returned to Durango, Mexico, with instructions never to return to New Mexico. This was predominantly a converso group of Jewish descent that was trying to get away from the Inquisition. In 1598, Don Juan Dianate led a large expedition north for permanent settlement. This included cattle, horses, four-horned sheep, goats, and even pigs driven up the road. Both one-axle cartas, and two-axle wagons were used, making this 1,500-mile road, El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, the oldest major wagon road in North America. Sections of this road, used until replaced by the railroad, are still visible in both New Mexico and Mexico. It is suspected that many of the settlers who accompanied him were from previous settlers forcibly removed for illegal entry into New Mexico a few years earlier. This is not proven, but it's suspected. The first settlement was made on the west side of the Chama River, just upstream from its junction with the Rio Grande. This was across the river from Ilke Pueblo and constituted land which had been developed by the Pueblo. Dianate did not find the gold, which was the desire of many of his party. His friars did not make the number of conversions they desired. Finally, Dianate's troops extracted a revenge attack on Acoma Pueblo, which, while militarily successful, left him open to charges of violation of the law of the Indians, the Spanish law established to protect the rights of the Native Americans. As this law was established a little before the time of Dianate started north, it is possible he had little knowledge of the law. Nevertheless, he was called back to New Spain, that is Mexico, and tried under its terms. His successor, with the authorities aware of the relationship they had developed with the Pueblos, was instructed to move the settlement away from the center of the Pueblo activities around Espanola. Thus, between 1607 and 1610, the Villa of Santa Fe was established as an official settlement, unlike the towns called Pueblos, an official settlement on the location of a prior but abandoned Pueblo site. The Spanish governing system required the Native Americans to work so many days a month for the Spanish landowners. The friars did their best to stop previous ways of worship of the Pueblos. The civilians after gold and land, and the friars after converts, spied and argued with one another, both sending conflicting reports back to New Spain. Resentment grew until on the 12th of August, 1680, the Pueblos rose in revolt. Some notice of this planning got to the authorities, but the revolt was so well planned that many of the outlying farms were lost, 21 of the friars were massacred, and the remaining Spanish gathered in Santa Fe, only to flee in a body back down the Camino Real to now what is Juarez, Mexico. This was the most successful resistance to the Spanish conquest by any native peoples in the Western Hemisphere. The revolt leader, the reported leader of the revolt, Pueblo, was never found some 18 years later during the Reconquest. Some scholars have speculated that this was a fictional leader, as the Pueblo leadership by this time included a number of men who had Spanish fathers and the beginnings of a fair education. Pueblo was an excuse to protect the identity of the real leadership. However, one of the two statutes in the Capitol in Washington, D.C., granted to each state for their significant leaders is of Pueblo. The Reconquest was rather peaceable. The threat to the Pueblos was raised by the other Native American peoples, and certain compromise paid the way for this. First, the system of requiring service by the Pueblo people to the Spanish was abolished. In addition, formal recognition was given to each Pueblo by the Spanish crown of legal status under Spanish law as a town owing no extra allegiance to nearby Spanish holdings. Second, the church was required to respect the Pueblo people's religious traditions. Though they could convert them, they could not forbid traditional practices. This policy still applies. Third, the threat from Apache, Navajo, and Comanche had greatly increased, so the Spanish and Pueblo needed each other to resist the pressure from the surrounding peoples. The goals of the Spanish and Pueblo complemented each other to a certain extent. The Pueblo was a dirt farmer, generally irrigated. The Jemez were dry land farmers. The Spanish wanted to be a rancher, a hidalgo. If gold could not be found, a man on horseback. Don Quixote is a good example of this mentality. Granted that most of the Spanish wound up being dirt farmers, the goal remained of being a man on horseback. Mutual new crops added to this, like fruits, vegetables, grains, and even the mud horno ovens in which to bake bread, coming via the Muslim conquest from the Near East. The Tigris-Euphrates Valley is apparently where this originated. Silverwork, sheep, and more elaborate weaving methods using straw to reinforce the adobe bricks, and grapes made into wine all complemented the joint culture, though the grapes, interestingly enough, were brought in against the Spanish rules, giving total profit for the wine, particularly for communion, to providers based in Spain. In this case, the friars also worked to subvert the Spanish colonial rules. The great governor of the Spanish administration was Juan Bautista de Anza, who later founded San Francisco. He was not only an able administrator, he may have been the most able military leader on the northern frontier of New Spain. He assembled a combined force of Spanish, Pueblo, and Utes for a campaign to the south, taking out the Llano Apache, who were a very serious threat to communications in Mexico City. They would have been located perhaps in the Las Cruces area of New Mexico. Then he turned northwest and pushed the Navajo back further from the Spanish and Rio Grande Pueblos. He then turned on his Ute allies and forced them to give the Pueblo and Spanish more maneuver room. Finally, and most famously, he made a winter campaign along the west side of the San Luis Valley without building fires to attract attention, and came down out of the mountains to catch the Comanche in winter camp on Fountain Creek below Colorado Springs, resulting in a draw battle and treaty, which led to a mostly commercial relationship with Spanish New Mexico and the Comanche to the east, a treaty which continued really until the time of the United States conquest. The height of the Spanish power, of course, ended with the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1580, 18 years before Oñate came north. By the late 1700s, Spain was clearly on the decline. New Mexico traded in wool and hides, not riches enough to justify Spanish investment. Texas was colonized to protect from the French in Louisiana, and California to protect from the Russians. New Mexico had limited garrisons because of both French and British activity to the north, but this was not adequate to really protect from the surrounding Native Americans. The later mineral wealth was not found or not accessible due to the Apache in the mountains where the minerals were located. Albuquerque was founded in 1706 as a way station on the Camino Real, which was between active pueblos, so agricultural land was available for development. Las Golondrinas, the first night stop on the Camino Real south of Santa Fe, is now a living museum of both the trail and the Spanish-Mexican influence over the last 400 years. The archives in Mexico City and in Sevilla, Spain, are excellent in preserving all of this information. This records back, at least in triplicate, and quite often 6 and 7 copies, so they wouldn't be lost. Unfortunately, neither system are cataloged as to these records, and they're very difficult to find stuff. Santa Fe's museums in buildings dating back to 1610 are very impressive. The book, quote, My Penitentiary Land, unquote, is an interesting introduction to Spanish New Mexico. The Mexican period has a large Anglo influence, so it will be included in this next lecture. The last 200 years of New Mexico history are filled with culture clashes, some serious, many pathetic. 14 years before Mexico obtained independence, Lieutenant Pike got himself caught in the San Luis Valley in the middle of the winter. This area is often the coldest place in continental United States at this time of the year. He and his party were both rescued and arrested by Spanish authorities. He claimed to be on a scientific expedition as part of the United States purchase of the Louisiana area, similar to the previous Lewis and Clark expedition some 3 years previous. The truth is almost certainly different, though having read a significant portion of his journals well concealed. How the headwaters of the Red River on the high plains of Texas could be confused with the headwaters of the Rio Grande, having crossed the Sangre de Cristals above La Vida Pass, can only be explained by extreme ineptitude or, in the mind of the Spanish authorities, spying. At about the same time, French and Yankee fur trappers began showing up in the Taos area. Some became Spanish citizens, some adopted the Roman Catholic faith, all alarmed the Spanish authorities, aware of the expansionist tendencies of the United States. Very soon, Father Hidalgo, educated at the Durango, Mexico Seminary, which was influenced by the Enlightenment thought and the American Revolution, proclaimed Mexican independence. Though he was quickly captured and imprisoned in Ciudad Chihuahua, later to be executed, this led to the independence for Mexico. Spain had a policy of keeping all the foreigners out. Under Mexico, trade was accepted from the United States, to be taxed at points of entry and exit, of course. This was announced in 1821, as was the first trips along the Santa Fe Trail. The first group of traders from Missouri essentially cleaned Santa Fe of all his hard money. Thus, the second group of traders went on down the Camino Real, renamed the Chihuahua Trail, in search of hard money. This commerce through Santa Fe to Ciudad Chihuahua and Ciudad Durango continued for over a century, with Pancho Villa getting most of his munitions through El Paso, and now drugs coming north along many of the same routes. The merchants in Santa Fe welcomed the Anglos, for the most part, with open arms. A profit is well understood in both cultures. By American occupation in 1846, it is estimated that fully 1/2 of the traders on the Santa Fe Trail were citizens of Mexico, most from the Santa Fe community. Some of them reported going as far east as New York City, ordering merchandise to be brought back down the Santa Fe Trail into Mexico. New Mexico had few priests, but those educated in Durango were outstanding. Father Martinez in Taos even worked with the Santa Fe traders to bring in a printing press and Spanish language type so that a Spanish language newspaper could be published for the benefit of the local people, though this was not completed until after the start of Yankee occupation. Metals were very limited in New Mexico, having been poor under the Pueblos, poor under the Spanish, and continued poor that way under the Mexican administration. Thus, even the tin cans of the Santa Fe traders were recycled into usable and artistic items for home and business, a skill still on the market in New Mexico. The solid axles of the wagons returning to Missouri were hollowed out so that some of the cash, hard cash, could be concealed within that to avoid the tax of the Mexican government. The merchants of both countries clearly prospered through this trade. Some scholars have speculated that the presence of the Santa Fe trade in industrial materials and weapons may have preserved both the Pueblo and Spanish cultures from collapse, as the new government in Mexico had neither the tax base to support nor the military organization to provide protection to the residents of northern New Mexico in face of increased pressure from Apache, Navajo, and Comanche raids. In the 1840s, the Yankees took half of the nation of Mexico, an item still stressed in Mexican history books to this day. First, Texas, though poor management from Mexico City encouraged a lot of the Spanish-speaking population to join the revolt, and then the remaining portion of the Southwest by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. General Grant felt this was such an unjustified land grab that he said in his autobiography that the bloodletting of the Civil War was in part punishment for the treatment we gave Mexico in that war. Northern New Mexico welcomed the United States Army for the most part, as profits and safety were more important than allegiance to the weak government in Mexico City. Donna Tules, operator of the finest gambling establishment west of St. Louis and the richest woman in New Mexico, loaned General Kearny money needed to pay the conquering troops when the pay wagon was delayed coming from Fort Leavenworth. At least that's one version of it. There's no question but she loaned General Kearny money for military activities when he did not have the funds from U.S. sources. The Battle of Gloriana Pass decided the war in the West, and most of northern New Mexico was strongly anti-slavery. Though the presence of the Colorado Volunteers and knowledge of the local geography certainly helped the Union cause. The Apache and others ran wild during the war. Following the war, efforts were made to settle the problems with the non-Pueblo natives, including placing the Navajo on a reservation at Fort Sumner. Kit Carson led the army. In violation of his orders to kill all adult males, he brought them to Fort Sumner and later testified before Congress of the injustice, allowing them and other Native peoples to return where possible to their ancestral homes. This he did, though suffering from the aneurysm, which was to kill him the next year. As the Bishop of Durango could not exercise the same authority over New Mexico after it became part of the United States, Rome appointed a French priest to come as bishop. Lamy commented to the Bishop of New Orleans while en route to his new assignment that he had misgivings about the Spanish and Native American savages that were to be his responsibility. I think he counted the Spanish as savages too. As the New Mexico priests educated in Durango were as competent or more so than Lamy, and as his attempt to impose French and Italian traditions on the Spanish church, which had differed in administrative methods since the Middle Ages, cultural tensions developed, which continue to this day. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad came over Raton Pass late in 1879 to build on through the state in the next 2 years, and junction with the Southern Pacific, building east at Deming to make the second transcontinental route and profit for both systems. This brought in mining machinery, milling, and other industrial supplies. Las Vegas became the largest town in the territory with a shipment of cattle, wool, and sheep to eastern markets. New Mexico had enough population in 1848 to become a state. However, its Spanish/Mexican heritage was considered a detriment to many in Washington. This was complicated by the political wisdom of Santa Fe in sending a Jesuit priest, not capable of speaking English, as a representative from the territory to a Protestant-dominated Congress. When asked after the Civil War, General Sherman advised that the correct solution to New Mexico's status in the United States was, quote, give it back to Mexico, unquote. Thus, statehood was delayed by 64 years, while various forms of corruption were practiced in the state, including a United States senator after statehood, having the distinction of doing time for fraud concerning national assets. The Spanish-speaking population suffered the most, with many of the Spanish grants being compromised. The tensions over this remained, with armed confrontations occurring with the last 40 years. Albuquerque became the center of the railroad industry, with equipment for track repair manufactured here until the 1980s. Coal mines opened up in a big way to meet the railroad's needs. Cattle shipping expanded significantly, being a factor in the Lincoln County War and Billy the Kid. Large silver deposits developed in the Western Mountains, as well as the expansion of previously known copper mining, which continues to this day. Homesteaders entered, resulting in the breaking of sod, which made northeastern New Mexico a significant part of the Dust Bowl. Patients suffering from TB flocked to the state, some of them actually recovering and really adding to the political leadership of the state. 100 years ago, federal irrigation projects increased agriculture production in a large way, with cotton and now pecans becoming large cash crops. With the Second World War, air bases and the Manhattan Project, military spending became a significant boost to the economy. Now computer chips, jewelry, and scientific instruments add to the complexity of the economy. The status of being a poor state, one lacking in water, resistant to change, and with no major ethnic group, remains part of the heritage, one which both attracts and repels those viewing the state from the outside. End of presentation. I'm open to questions.
Ted, thank you so much. Very interesting. I did not know how Mexico become part of the historical, about the different Indian tribes, and later Spanish, and how Catholicism, took effect.
Yeah, at one time before the revolt of 1680, a Bo mission was the head of the Inquisition here in New Mexico. And of course, the settlement that was taken back to Durango was apparently by conversos who were trying to flee from the Inquisition. So we have this conflict taking place. There are cemetery headstones in northern New Mexico and in the San Luis Valley of Colorado, dating from the 17 and 1800s, that are inscribed in Hebrew. If that tells you anything about what's going on in the state.
Abo Mission was the headquarters for the Inquisition in New Mexico. Over near Mountain Air.
The part of this is a length of history that simply is not picked up in the normal United States history books. The comment was made by, I think it's someone of Pueblo ancestry. Only in New Mexico can 400 years be considered recent history. We simply have a different historical line compared to the rest of the nation. And it's been continuous. It's not interrupted, but like I say, the overhead beams in what's supposed to be the oldest house in Acoma were cut in, I think, 1620 and in Taos, 1630. Of course, the towns are older than that, but they can document when the overhead beams were actually harvested, 1310 and 1320. That's 700 years ago, folks. And the same people have been living there ever since. It's just, we don't think that way. But to understand New Mexico, that has to go into the equation, that the historical line is double that in most of the United States.
More than double.
I saw Nancy come in.
And Nancy,
Oh.
welcome.
Thanks. Ted, I had a question.
Sure.
Did I hear you say that the Folsom and the Clovis groups of people were the oldest native groups
No. They're the oldest that are widely accepted.
accepted? I see. In the
The
North American
North
or
American.
Northern Hemisphere?
Their particular style of flint of shaping their spearheads had been found from central Mexico well up into Saskatchewan. They were big game hunters. Now that's not saying they're the earliest. They're widespread and well established. We have information even from southern Chile dating back as far, and took a long time to walk down that far. So there may very well be several thousand years older. We don't know. These are widely established sites which were first found in New Mexico. Widely established cultures.
Yeah, they date what, 10,000
10 to 12,000 years before
Yeah.
present.
BC.
One other question. Could you just say something again about, you said that some, I think it was the Navajo, can understand some of the natives in Alaska?
The Dene language is Alaska, Athabascan, Alaska, and Western Canada. That's also the same language the Apache and Navajo speak. They are newcomers, not in our timeline, but they're newcomers in the history of the Native Americans here in New Mexico. The Pueblos were here 1,000 years and more before the Athabascan speaking people showed up. And I've actually,
Yeah, they can communicate today, or have their languages
they
diverged
can
enough?
communicate today. Is that recent?
That's amazing.
Yeah, it is.
Now, it's not, there's a different dialect, you know, but they have less trouble than we would have with Middle English. And it's about the same age.
Mm. Very good.
See, that would have been right at the beginning of the Ice Age. And, you know, Western Canada, we've been there, seen the glaciers and what have you. Now, that was not a very agreeable place to be. In 1300, they came south. You can't blame them. In fact, is some of the oldest Spanish maps refer to the inhabitants west of the Rio Grande as the Navajo Apache. They understood them simply as one of the divisions of the Apache.
Oh, very good. That's very interesting.
Other questions?
Anybody have any, other questions?
I admit, for me, this is a lot of fun.
Uh-huh. It was. Thank you so much.
a lot
Do
to
you have
absorb.
anything you'd like?
And I'm real grateful that it's recorded so I can go back and absorb it a little more slowly too.
There's a lot of data in that.
Very lot, yes.
It's dense. And a lot of it is, like I say, it's not footnoted. Like the bit about this 1680s inscription by a Roman Catholic priest northeast of town, that cropped up once in the Albuquerque Journal and has never been referred to again. It's on Pueblo land, and obviously the Pueblo people don't want anybody in there investigating. These things, you know, the right hand doesn't always talk to the left hand of the state. Just like the Pueblo ceremonies, many of them are closed to the public, things of this nature. So sometimes you sort of have to piece the story together.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
My
In
pleasure.
the last 3 months. Okay. Oh, thank you. It is so.
I thank you for tolerating me enough to listen to it.
That is great.
No, that was
Excellent.
I enjoyed it very much.
Fascinating, intense, and well worth the time investment. Thank you. I'm
Yes.
going to end our recording.